Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS Week 1 overview and analysis video. And then, of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Incredibly excited to finally get the LCS season underway. Summer splits had a lot of controversy already with the start of the split and everything going on, the walkout, yada, yada, yada. If you watched my primer video, you know my thoughts on the situation. You know my thoughts on all 10 teams and the outlook that they are probably having going into this split. If you want to check that video out, the link to that's going to be up in the iCard right there. I not only go over my power rankings for all 10 teams, but I also talk about my player rankings, the advantages, the disadvantages, playstyle, changes, things like that for all 10 teams in the league. So if you want a little bit of a comprehensive rundown before we jump into the first week of games, that video is definitely for you. But I'm really excited to get into this, and I hope you guys are as well. So let me know down in the comment section below what you guys were expecting to happen in week number 1. Did it go as you expected, or were there a couple of surprises? I know for me, there were definitely quite a few surprises in terms of outcomes, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Of course, if you're new to the channel, what we do here is go through all 15 games that happened in week 1 here in the LCS. Of course, with the walkout, we now have a little bit of a condensed schedule. Basically, every single week is a super week now in the LCS, and so 15 games across 3 days. We're going to be going over all 15. I'm going to give a player of the game, my dud of the game, and then at the end of the week, I'll give not only my updated power rankings, but my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 1 here in the LCS. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. We kicked off the LCS Summer Split with a finals rematch here between the two teams that just came back from MSI. We had Cloud9 taking on Golden Guardians, and Cloud9, just like pretty much all the other times, was able to get the upper hand in this matchup. They're just the better team out of these two, and they certainly have Golden Guardians' number in terms of matchups, and I think that's a really big deal for them. Golden Guardians, we'll talk about them a bit in a second, but I think Cloud9 is just, in general, a really good team. Now, it helps that they were getting Cassante, Zeri, and Milio on blue side in this game. That is definitely going to be a little bit of a positive. Golden Guardians not necessarily respecting some of the picks that I think a lot of people consider incredibly strong in the meta right now, but it wasn't just the picks that pushed them across the finish line. You do have to still execute on the picks. As strong as something like Zeri is, you do still need to play her at a high level. We've seen plenty of bad Zeris even on this ridiculously overpowered patch, and so you still got to be a good AD carry. You still got to be able to step up and deal the damage, but Berserker was definitely in the market to do that in this game. He's going to get my player of the game in the first game of the split. Really good stuff from him. Obviously, I ranked him as my number 1 AD carry coming into the split. That was a tough decision to make with how good Prince is as a player, but I think Berserker at this point has proven that he is just on a little bit of a different level in terms of consistency and in terms of what he's able to offer as a carry in the back half of games. The early game actually wasn't all that great for Cloud9 here, which you might not expect with a 26-minute win, but by the time they hit the mid, and especially the mid to late game, their team fight potential was just so much stronger. Golden Guardians really didn't have any way to keep up, even if they were relatively even in gold, and so Cloud9 just kind of ran out of, I guess Golden Guardians, I should say, ran out of steam, and Cloud9 capitalized on that. Berserker's team fighting was definitely, in my opinion, the biggest reason for that, so big ups to Berserker. I thought he played really well, was definitely my player of the game. And then other players that you got to shout out, Blabber was fantastic on the Kindred, a lot of really good damage coming out in the mid game, and really that was a big separator when you're going into something like Jax. That actually can be a relatively tough matchup for Kindred, because obviously he can nullify your auto attacks, which is all of your damage as Kindred, and you're kind of really hoping that you're going to be able to get in. But Blabber, I think, did a really good job in team fights of being able to utilize the ultimate and utilize his damage to kind of push the team forward. And then I also think Fudge was pretty fantastic in this game. I know Cassante is a really overloaded pick, but Fudge plays it better than anybody in North America. He's the best top laner by a consistent margin, in my opinion, and he proved it again against Licorice. As good as Licorice has been in recent memory, he still has his problems in terms of what he's able to offer consistently over the course of an entire split, or at least that's what he showed in spring. I still think he's a good player, but Fudge is on a little bit of a different level, and I would say Fudge, Blabber, Berserker, all players who were top 1 in their role in the league, definitely showing up here in the first game. And then Golden Guardians on the other side, it's kind of expected. Like, I hate to say it, but like, Cloud9 kind of owns you, and they've kind of owned you all year long. Golden Guardians really has not been able to keep up. My dud of the game is going to go to Stixay. I think you could realistically give this to quite a few members. Licorice was definitely in contention. He was in contention as well. I just think that most of these players ended up getting outplayed in terms of the team fight stage in the late game, and that's a little bit concerning, but it is Lucian Nami. I do want to cut them at least a little bit of slack, but I would have liked to see at least a little bit more aggression, a little bit more playmaking intensity coming out from Stixay on this Lucian. I think that would have made me feel a lot more comfortable with how this team was moving into the mid to late game, but I think they just gave Cloud9 a little bit too much space to be able to get back in, and obviously, C9's a team that's going to be able to capitalize on that. I don't think Kuki played particularly great on the Nami either. Bot lane was honestly just worse than Cloud9's, and then, like I said earlier, Licorice just kind of got outplayed by Fudge in the top lane, and so not really a lot of good to say there. I do think that there were some moments from River that looked relatively alright on this Jax jungle pick. Really not seeing this anywhere else in the world, so really cool to see them, bring it out here in the first game, try something different. It's early on in the split, so I'm not going to, freak out and be like, you have to play the meta stuff. If you think a Jax jungle can be strong, go ahead and play it. Jax is a strong pick and can do a lot both in the mid and the late game, and so I understand the idea, and River, I thought, piloted it relatively well, especially into a pick like Kindred, but it just wasn't going to be enough, and Gory was more of a facilitator. No real mistakes, but no major advantages for the team either, and so basically exactly what we were expecting to see from Golden Guardians. Just a fine performance, but not on the level of a team like Cloud9, who really is the best team in the league. I know people are, looking for a reason to not like Cloud9 or to call them anything other than that, but they have only proven that they are the best team in the league over this year so far. They've been the most consistent, they have the most talent, they've shown the most on the Rift. There really is nothing that we can say other than Cloud9 is right now #1 in North America. And then moving on to our second game of day #1 here, and it's another decently intriguing matchup between Team Liquid and TSM that TL is actually going to be able to pick up the win in. Not particularly surprising, at least in terms of my power rankings, but this is a little bit of a different result than what we were seeing from both of these teams last split. TL not really making any sort of changes. TSM, of course, making quite a few, bringing up Hanser from their academy team. He was in the lineup in the last week of the season, but that was more of an emergency substitution. Now he is a full-time starter for them because of how he was playing in the NACL, which is a really good choice. I completely agree. And then because Ruby is not here yet, I presume that he is going to be their main starting mid laner. Insanity has been brought in to fill in, and I've talked about this. I think Insanity is a better player than Ruby is, and I think he will be better in this lineup, but we'll certainly see. Right now, TSM's just running with a little bit of a mismatch, and so Team Liquid is going to be able to take advantage of that and be able to pull out the win. Now, this game was relatively weird to watch. TL gets another massive lead in the early game, and this is what they've done incredibly well over the course of this year already. This has always been their strength as a team, is being able to generate those early leads, being able to basically just out-mechanic whoever they're playing against, especially in lane. If you give Summit a 1v1, he's going to look pretty great. If you give Yon and Core a 2v2, they're going to look really good. That's what this team really excels at. I think Pioshik is much better in the early game than he is in the late game, especially when he actually has to make decisions for this team, and so Team Liquid, I think, in a position where, they have a 7-8k gold lead moving into 20-25 minutes. That's pretty good. However, TSM was actually in this game, even down 7 or 8k gold. It was not over by any means because Team Liquid has no idea how to close out games as a team. They just don't really understand what they're supposed to be doing at that point in the game, and it continued to be a little bit of a problem. Of course, they still are able to pick up the win, but it was certainly a little bit more contentious than maybe you would have wanted if you were a TL fan. My player of the game is going to go to Summit in the top lane. An awesome Kennen game coming in for him. Not only did he dominate the laning phase, as Kennen is kind of known to do, especially into a matchup like Malphite, where Kennen can really kind of take over in the early game if he builds, AP pretty quickly, but he's obviously a huge team fight threat if you're willing to play him very aggressively, and if there's one thing Summit's willing to do, it's go on these big flank patterns and play really aggressively in team fights, and I think he really pulled off the Kennen well. If you're getting a good version of Summit this split, Team Liquid's upside is going to go through the roof, because the difference between Team Liquid being the #7 team in the power rankings and being number 4 or number 3 in the power rankings is legit Summit playing like he did in 2022 spring. If he's an MVP caliber player, this team is going to be a lot better than anything that they were at any point in the spring, but he really did show that that's still in him, at least right now in game #1. Pioshik was a little bit better, still an absolute psychopath in the jungle. That Baron Pip play was incredibly funny, just walking in and almost instantly dying and then walking out only to walk back in and then instantly die. It's just that's peak Pioshik, really, when you think about it. Really, really funny from him, but his early pathing, I think, is really, really solid and is certainly a lot better than other players in the LCS in particular, and I think Yon and Core are an underratedly very good bot lane duo, but this really was Summit's game, and he was definitely the standout member for Liquid. On the TSM side, Like I said, they were down 7 or 8k gold, but they were actually still in this game, which I think you do have to commend the team for. Wild Turtle was doing his job as the Xayah, trying to deal as much damage as possible. I think Boogie had some pretty good engages in this game as well, but the rest of this team was just a little bit disjointed. I think that's the word I want to go for here. Azale was flaming the shit out of Chime for that early engage, but on retrospect, especially watching it back, it really wasn't Chime's fault. He went in basically at the exact right moment in that final fight that he needed to, but Hanser didn't want to pull the trigger on the Flash Malphite ultimate, and I think if both of them go in at the same time, I think that is a one fight for TSM. I legit think it probably wins them the game, but Hanser didn't want to pull the trigger. I'm not entirely blaming Hanser for that decision because, you know, if Hanser's not going to go in, Chime also needs to not go in, but the communication just simply needed to be better from those two players. I think if they both were synced up and made the play together, whether that was right then or later in the team fight, I think it would have gone a lot better, but unfortunately, it just wasn't meant to be. Hanser is going to get my dud of the game, though, because he really did get kind of blasted in the laning phase, and that was a pretty big mistake in the final team fight of the game that did ultimately cost them, and so definitely something that you don't really want to see from a player like Hanser, but it is going up against Summit, right? Hanser's a solid player, but not a superstar at this level, and as much as I do think he was very good, arguably the best and most consistent top laner in the NACL across the spring split, you know, maybe other than like Fake God, or Bradley or players like that, I still think that he has some limitations, right? He's not just the superstar that's going to step in and be a top 4, top 5 top laner in the region basically from moment one. He's going to be fine, but, you know, we kind of saw the weaknesses of him in this game, but I still think TSM has relatively decent talent on this team. Clearly, there's just a little bit of communication error coming from some of these new players. And then for Liquid, it's a really nice way to start your split. I still need to see more cleanliness. What would be the word there? You guys let me know. I still need to see them be more clean down the stretch of games because they really don't know how to close things out. They are simply just too sloppy towards the back half of games. If they can figure out how to, you know, consistently be able to take their leads and generate it into pressure towards the back half of the game and not fumble some of these major team fights, they're going to be one of the most dangerous teams in the league. But right now, that's just not a reality. It's a team that is very good at getting early game leads, and they're probably going to be pretty adept at taking out teams that aren't as cohesive towards the back half of games, but might continue to struggle against some of the best teams in the league. And then moving on now to game number 3 here on day 1, and this one I was actually kind of looking forward to. We had Immortals taking on Dignitas, and Immortals with actually a super clean win in this one. I know it's Dig, I know it's not the toughest opponent to face in the entire world, but honestly, this Immortals team looked very good on the first day of LCS, basically exactly what you could have asked for. And man, if they keep that up, that's going to be a super fun developing storyline here. But let's go ahead and talk about what ended up happening. This was just a clean win, I would say, from Immortals. Not really a lot of negatives to talk about. My player of the game is going to go to Kenvi. This is the Kenvi that we were promised years ago. This is finally starting to seem like a player that is picking up some steam. Obviously, a couple of new players on this team that I think definitely help out the ability to play a little bit more consistently solo in the top lane. Congratulations on being the first ever 30-plus-year-old player to play in the LCS. That's a very fun record for him to hold, I should say, and he holds it proudly. And then Treats coming in, I think, is definitely helping out this team. You can feel his impact and his effect in game number 1, but Kenvi really was the star of this game. He was everywhere on the map. He was out jungling Santorin into oblivion. Just good stuff, like consistently good stuff coming in from the jungler on Immortals. And I know we talked a long time about how Kenvi was the big future jungler superstar of the LCS when he was in the 100 Thieves system. Ends up wanting to wait for a good team in the LCS, and we kind of see why as he gets thrown into this Immortals team, and it really does not work at all. And he's kind of lowered his stock significantly and tremendously on his ability to be able to gain big contracts, but we know he still has the ability to be a big player at this level. We've seen him be able to do it, and I think the really good thing is that he's been able to do it here on a more supportive, a more, you know, I guess, facilitative type of champion. I think that's the word I'm probably looking for. He's really known for his marksman in the jungle. The Kindred and especially the Graves have been very big picks for him over the course of his career, but being able to pull out the Sejuani and out jungle a player like Santorin, who, yes, is having pretty undoubtedly the worst year of his career up until this point, but still, it's Santorin. He knows what he's supposed to do. The being able to out-jungle him on Sejuani, I think, is a huge boon, a huge positive, and it's something that I think is going to give a lot of Immortals fans hope. But Solo was really good in the top lane on the Scion, making a lot of impact in those late-game team fights, but just being a really big, consistent rock for this team. He's not Revenge. He's not even really a similar player at all. It definitely felt like Revenge and Kenvi were getting on the same page as the split was winding down, but I think Solo and Kenvi could honestly be a better duo duo, with Kenvi kind of being the one that wants to take a lot of the resources, and Solo more than happy, I think, to give over those resources. The player that I've always compared Solo to is Finn over in the LEC, or obviously was in the LCS for a little bit on CLG, but I think they're very similar players in terms of playstyle and what they offer to the team. They both can carry, and they both are definitely good team fighters, but are more well known for being pieces that you can kind of leave alone on an island and just kind of let happen and kind of invest into other parts of the team. I think if Solo can have a similar kind of impact for this team, that's going to be positive overall. But again, Tactical and Treats were a lot better in this game as well, I should say. It was a little bit of a bot gap for sure. Tactical was just better than Tomo. We'll get to Tomo a little bit later in this week, not necessarily in this game, but Treats is definitely someone that I think is going to help him out. It's really good to reunite and pair these two back up from the TSM Academy days, and definitely feels like that chemistry has not waned. They're both performing better in game number 1 than really Tactical looked at all in 2023 up until this point. But Lulu is solid in the mid lane. He was this team's best player down the stretch. Immortals just has a lot of things to be excited about right now, and I think that's a very cool thing. Dignitas, not so much. I think we were hoping to see a little bit of a better version of this team, bringing in Rich, bringing in Diamond. You know, these were two players that I think were definitely supposed to be upgrades. Diamond was supposed to be better than Ignar, and I still believe that he can be, but Tomo and Diamond didn't exactly look great in the bot lane in game number 1, and Rich really didn't have that massive of an impact. You know, I said that he was going to be good for this region, in particular for the LCS, because he is someone who is very good in team fights, even if he has no idea how to survive a laning phase, and, you know, you can kind of get away with that a little bit more in North America than you can in other regions, but all of that is predicated on the idea that this jungle mid duo has to be better than they were in spring, and Santorin was just simply not. He's going to get my dud of the game here, 0-3-0 on Rek'Sai, and it was the same kind of problems that he was having in spring. It just feels like he is mentally so disconnected from the game. He's not thinking about decisions. He's constantly in the wrong spot. He's behind and slow on every single play. I can't really explain it to you. This is not the Santorin that we've all grown accustomed to. He's just playing at a level that is not nearly close to what he has been over the past few years. It's disappointing to say the least, but Jensen wasn't particularly great either. I've seen people say that Santorin and Jensen as a duo are the Razork and Humanoid of the LCS, and I couldn't agree more. I actually think that's a super apt comparison. Two very good players that have obviously shown they can be elite players in the past, but just have no synergy together as a duo, and clearly just aren't going to work on the same team. And obviously, Fnatic has more upside, I would say, than anything that Dignitas has right now, but I think in terms of what we've seen, I like that analogy in terms of how to describe it. But for Dig, you just got to figure something out. This jungle mid has to be better. They're going to have to be a catalyst for the rest of this team to be able to move forward. As good as Rich is, he's not going to win early. He's not going to dominate and get these giant leads in the top lane that you can snowball. Tomo and Diamond have the potential to do that, but they're also very inexperienced players at this level, at least in terms of winning, and so you're really relying on those more veteran players to step up, and right now, it's just not happening. This feels eerily similar to Spring Dignitas, which is unfortunate. And then Immortals looks good. I'm not going to, overblow them and say that they look fantastic and that they're a top 5 team in the league or anything like that, but game number 1 was definitely a win for them, or a success, and I think they're going to look back on this with a lot of positives. And then moving on to game number 4, and this one I'm very, very excited to talk about because we have a perfect game on day number 1 in the LCS, and it's an LCS debut that maybe did not go as you would have hoped. We had Evil Geniuses taking on NRG, and EG does get that perfect game going. That's 16-0, no towers, no objectives, no nothing coming in from the side of NRG in their first ever game back here in the LCS after what's been, like 5 or 6 years? It's been quite a while for this org. Not exactly what you were looking for when starting your time here again, but it is what it is. Evil Geniuses has to be commended for what they were able to do, and I know I was a little bit higher on this team than a lot of other people were. I've seen some people rank them higher in power rankings, but I think I spoke of them with a little bit more confidence than a lot of other people did. I love a lot of the players on this team. I think Unforgiven and Ayla is a super scary bot lane. Revenge is a very good top laner. Armeo has been nothing but solid in the academy scene for years, and Jojo Pume can be a superstar. If you give him the keys to the kingdom, he can absolutely take over games, and you know what? We absolutely saw that. Someone posted that Keanu Reeves, John Wick gif of, yeah, I'm thinking I'm back. Yeah, I'm thinking Jojo Pune's back. He's feeling and looking pretty damn good after that Korean boot camp. The Gragas coming out, a champion that he didn't really play all that well in spring. He had a couple of good moments on it, but I think when you look at the stretch of time that he put in on Gragas, it wasn't nearly as explosive as you would hope it would be for Mr. Bomba, but Jojo played him fantastic here in game number 1. This is about as good of a start to the split as you can have. Jojo looked like the superstar that we were kind of hoping he would be, and he is an easy choice for player of the game here in game number 1. I think if you let him, like, unlock his playstyle and just kind of move around the map and be a little bit more explosive and be someone that this team can pump a lot of resources in and play through, you're still going to have some bad moments because he can be a little bit coin flippy in terms of what he actually offers, but you're going to, I think, see a better version of JoJo than what we saw in spring, and I think that's going to be good overall. I think that there was a little bit of a conflict of interest in terms of where that team wanted to expend its resources. Inspired was obviously kind of a late game team fighter for that team, which is very weird to say out of the jungle position, but FBI and Vulcan definitely wanted a lot of resources in the early game, not necessarily because they're high resource players, but again, because the meta just in that point was very bot lane heavy, and it still is, but I think this team is going to be much more willing to give resources to JoJo Pune. Unforgiven has played weak side a lot before on Mad Lions. Revenge is somebody who is more than capable of just playing in the 1v1, and he kind of likes that circumstance, I think, a lot as well, and Armeo is definitely more of a facilitator in the jungle position. This team is definitely set up for JoJo to look like a superstar, and in game number 1, it absolutely worked, but everybody else was also pulling their weight. Unforgiven and Ayla were fantastic. Really good to see Ayla performing as well as he did. Obviously, it's a Yuumi game. I'm not going to overblow it, but really hoping for a bounce back split from him. I like him a lot as a player. Unforgiven definitely dealing a lot of damage on that Lucian. Really good to see him back in a major league. He did not deserve to be stuck in the NACL. No offense to the NACL, right? Still a very good league, but he was just simply better than the players that he was playing against at that level, and really good to see him back in the LCS, or in the LCS here, and I think he's going to perform really well. Revenge on a tank in the top side and still winning lane. That's super impressive. And then Armeo just doing everything he needs to do to shut down NRG and not really allow them any sort of macro plays or objective control or anything like that throughout the game. It was just very clinical and very dominant from the side of Evil Geniuses. And then for NRG on the other side, about as disastrous of a start to your LCS career as you could possibly have. Obviously, there were some questions about the replacement of this bot lane. Luger and Puma are out. FBI and Ignar are in. I like this change because I think FBI is a very good player, but it did not work out in game number 1 here. I am going to give dud of the game to Palafox, but man, give it to Dokla, give it to Contracts, give it to FBI, give it to Ignar, give it to all of them. They all get dud of the game. No one played well here. I honestly just picked Palafox because JoJo was the one popping off. It wasn't like Palafox played particularly worse than everybody else on this team. I just need to give a dud of the game, and it really goes to NRG as a whole. They showed absolutely no fight in game number 1 here. I don't know if this is going to be a trend for them. CLG already was a rather streaky team, a team that could show up or just completely not show up, and that was very much what happened in this first game, as they just didn't show up, but I don't really know if I project that to be their entire split. This honestly feels rather predictable for me that they're going to be, you know, maybe fine. I'm not necessarily sure they're going to be a top 6 team. It does concern me that they got blown out here, but it's just game number 1. I don't want to overreact. It is worth noting, though, that literally every single player in every single lane in this game got completely destroyed and gapped, and that's never really what you want to see out of a season debut, but this team does have talent. It just clearly wasn't meant to be in this game number 1. There's not really a lot of analysis I can do. They just played bad, and they played, I would say, worse than their normal performances, which is more concerning. So NRG, I think, hopefully should be able to bounce back, but what a demoralizer to start your split. And then Evil Geniuses, this has to feel really, really good. If JoJo can keep this pace up, if the rest of this team can continue to be a really big positive, my prediction of them getting into the playoffs might be an understatement of what this team is able to accomplish. And then moving on to our 5th and final game of the first day here in week number 1, we had a playoff rematch from round number 1 as we saw FlyQuest taking on 100 Thieves. And 100 Thieves do pick up the win. It's not quite a perfect game, but it is very close. We almost had 2 back-to-back here on day number 1 in the LCS. Certainly a wild opening day for games that weren't particularly close, but good for 100 Thieves to be able to pick up this all-important opening win for them. One thing to note, Quid is not here yet. He is, actually. I think he was here on the day of these games, but he had just flown in, probably was crazy jet lagged. They were going to rest him for a week anyways, so Nuke Duck is going to be filling in as their mid laner. Obviously, he's their head coach, so pretty wild that he's allowed to come in and play, but he's going to come in and be their new mid laner, at least for week number 1. I doubt he plays much beyond that, but very funny situation there. So Nuke Duck coming in, obviously, he's fine. Not going to be a superstar for this team, but certainly is going to be good enough to be able to win with, and that was clearly the case here in this first game, as they played incredibly well, both early and late. It was just a relative rout coming out from 100 Thieves over a FlyQuest team that I think a lot of people were looking at as majorly improved, with Vulcan coming in into the support position. Hopefully a bounce back coming in from that devastating playoff loss in the semifinals to not go to MSI. And, you know, I think a lot of people had high expectations of FlyQuest, myself included. So to see 100 Thieves come out and just kind of dominate them in their first game is certainly very surprising, but it really does feel like summer is here because Doublelift is performing at a very high level. He's going to get my player of the game here. Summer Doublelift is a real thing. I know I'm not really the one to call out, Summer X player, but Doublelift has gone on record stating he doesn't try as hard in spring because it doesn't mean as much. And honestly, he's right to say that. Spring means literally nothing other than going to MSI, which you can, it's great. Obviously, it would be great to go to MSI, but it's more important to go to Worlds, if you will. And so Doublelift, really showing up in this first series, getting his Lucian, one of his best champions, if not his single best champion of all time, so good to see him continuously perform on that, but him and Busio have developed a really nice chemistry over this past year, and I think that those two are a really successful bot lane. Doublelift was good in spring. I don't want to take that away from him. He was the focal point carry for this team, and I think this team made a lot of decisions in the offseason to try and make that even more of a priority for them, getting rid of Tenacity and bringing Someday back in for weak side, bringing someone like Quid in who isn't going to necessarily, be as much of a focal point for the shot calling as a player like Bjergsen will be. It's definitely more of a focused ideology towards playing into this bot side, and I think it definitely paid off, at least in this first game. But Nukeduck was actually really good on this Ahri. He was moving around the map and being really active, I guess I would say, and really in specific helping Closer out quite a bit in the jungle matchup, really giving him as much pressure as he needed to be able to go all the places that he needed. Whether that was top lane, whether that was bot lane, it was basically wherever he needed to be that he was going to give a lot of resources. You gotta give a huge shout out to Someday in the top lane, though. I think the broadcast gave him player of the game, and I totally understand that. Gets one of his signature picks here in Renekton. That and the Aatrox are definitely the two things that come to mind when I think of Someday, and man, he absolutely destroyed on this pick. Going into a good player in Impact, he showed why I had him as my #1 top laner in North America going into the year. He hasn't necessarily lived up to that billing on Evil Geniuses, but back on that 100 Thieves team that he's just been so successful on and so dominant on for so many years, it could reawaken that part of him. And I really do think he looked like the #1 top laner, or at least close to that in this game here. So good stuff. Someday, Doublelift definitely the standout members, but Nukeduck actually looking very good. Busio looking good. Closer looking good. This team just looked a lot more complete than they did at any point in spring. And then for FlyQuest on the other side, a miserable start to the split. Again, very similar to what we just said about NRG, just slightly less doom and gloom. This team has a crazy amount of upside, and I think we all expect them to be able to hit it at some point, but it is a very, very rough way to start the split to see this. And Prince in particular was just not very good in this game. He's going to get my dud of the game, and not really the way that I want to see my spring MVP bouncing back. Obviously, it ended up going to Berserker, and rightfully so. I think it was really between those two and maybe Fudge in that conversation, but Prince was very, very good, and people just kind of forgot that because he wasn't as great in the playoffs in the regular season last split, and this was a little bit of an extension of the negative parts of his game. Hopefully he's going to be able to figure out. Him and Vulcan are two ridiculously talented players. If they can't come together and be a solid bot lane duo, that's going to be incredibly disappointing, but Vikla also played pretty bad here on the Jace, going into a player in Nukeduck who is, for all intents and purposes, retired, and then Impact and Speaka all lost pressure. Impact was definitely worse than Someday, and Speaka just really couldn't do anything on the Maokai once Closer got ahead, and especially once Nukeduck started moving around the map. And so a very disappointing game from FlyQuest. Basically all the negatives that you could ask for were shown up in this one, and you're really just hoping that at some point the talent of these players comes out and they find some level of synergy, because in this first game it just looked completely inept. And then for 100 Thieves, they looked good. If they can keep this up, that's going to be great. But again, another team and another side that has been relatively inconsistent over the course of the year. It's great that they were able to pick up this massive victory in game #1, but they're going to have to do it, over the course of an entire split rather than just in a couple of games. I do believe that this team has it in them. I think Someday is going to be an upgrade in the top lane, and I think once Quid gets in here, that's going to raise the ceiling of this team, but it is a really, really good, promising start to see that they at the very least can do this against a good team. And now we get to move on to day #2. Of course, in the Super Week, it's not the final day. It is just the middle day here in the LCS. And we kicked off day #2 with the matchup between Dignitas and Cloud9 that C9 was able to take. No surprises there. C9's the better team, and they really did show it. Really didn't expect this to be all that, difficult of a game for them to win, and luckily, they came out and executed on it, and that's exactly what we really wanted to see from them. Dignitas looked pretty horrendous on day 1. They definitely looked better on day #2, but the main problems of this team are absolutely still there. Some of these players are just not there mentally. I don't know if they're just completely checked out, or if there's something internally wrong with communication or something like that, but it's not working, especially this jungle mid duo. It continues to really just not work, and so we'll talk about Dignitas in a bit, but it's time to talk about Cloud9 getting their second win of the season here. Really nice from them. Player of the game is going to go to Blabber on that Kha'Zix. Really fun to see him on champions that can really express this snowball potential. That's what Blabber has always done at a very high level. It's not the only thing that he does at a high level because he's just an elite level player, but it's really fun to see him on a champion where if he goes bot lane 400 times in the game, he's going to pick up 400 kills. That's just kind of how it happens, and so really good to see the team kind of invest into him. He's the best jungler that this region has ever seen, and he continues to prove it basically every single split that he plays, so really, really good stuff coming out from him. He was also fantastic in this one. Berserker and Sven were definitely the better bot lane. They received a ridiculous amount of attention coming in from Blabber in the jungle. You need to make sure that Kha'Zix can get the ball rolling, especially if you have an Aphelios and you're going into something like a Jinx. Both of them scale so well that you need to kind of be the difference maker in terms of the damage when it comes to kind of how the mid game ends up going, and so Blabber knew that. He wanted to get into the bot lane. He had an Annie that could make some roams if needed as well, but just the perma ganks bot lane were definitely an assistance to Berserker and Sven, who, yes, did play well, but also, again, received a crazy amount of attention throughout this entire game, which was a good thing. And then Eminus was also pretty good on the Annie. Again, not necessarily a focal point, but definitely the better mid laner between these two teams, and really wasn't all that close in that department. The only player who I think made some questionable choices was Fudge, and that was really just the early laning phase. Rich actually did a really good job in lane, which is not something I thought I would say into Fudge in particular. Like, maybe some of the other top laners who aren't quite as proficient in lane, that's why I thought Rich was going to do well here, but Fudge in particular, not the player that I thought Rich was going to have the upper hand on in lane, but Rich was doing a very good job on that Cassante, exerting pressure onto the Jax. Not a very good matchup for Jax, in my opinion. I'm not a top lane player, though, so what do I know? But, yeah, Fudge was definitely, I would say, the weak link of Cloud9, was still relatively relevant in the team fights and in the back half of the game, and Rich certainly wasn't all that great towards the back half either, but Blabber, Berserker, Sven, definitely kind of the focal points, and Blabber in particular, definitely the one Cloud9 member that I think a lot of people are going to walk away looking at in this game. And then Dignitas on the other side, poor Tomo, poor Diamond. I feel so bad for them. I'm going to give Tomo dud of the game, but it's not because he particularly played bad. It's just like the dude got mega camped in the bot lane. Like, I felt so bad for him on that Jinx. He never really got a moment to actually play the game. He was consistently not only having to lane into Berserker and Sven, and that's already a tough enough challenge as it is in the isolated 2v2, but then Blabber is there consistently all game long. Eminus is making roams, doing 4-man plays bot, and your team is just not reacting. Santorin is just AFK, farming jungle camps. Like, I don't even really know what is going on with him. I wanted to give him dud of the game here, but it really did feel like it would be disingenuous to not give it to Tomo purely because of the amount of gold he gave over to the enemy side. But again, like, what is he supposed to do in that instance? So Santorin playing really bad, looks like the worst jungler in the league by a country mile, and he kind of was that in spring as well. And so I don't really know what to tell you. It feels like pretty much all of the positive momentum that Santorin had been generating in the LCS over the past 3-4 years, you know, since he kind of returned and really re-established himself in this league, is just gone. It's all been wiped away because he just can't perform even remotely playable on this Dignitas team. And then Jensen's also been bad. I don't want it to seem like Jensen has not been just like, you know, he was okay in spring and he had moments where he looked good, but he wasn't that takeover threat, and we kind of knew that, but he's really been bad to start this split. Both of the first two games, you could argue that Jensen was the worst player in each game. No synergy with Santorin, absolutely no pressure coming out of the mid lane, and certainly no roams coming out from a champion like Ahri, which is just a disaster. Nothing is going right for this Dignitas team, except maybe for Rich in lane, in the top lane. Like, he's a decent player, and he's definitely going to be good for this level, but he's certainly not going to be enough to drag this team across the finish line. Dignitas continues to look like the worst team in the LCS, and I really don't see a lot of reasons for that to change. And then Cloud9 looks like the best team in the LCS right now, and again, I said this before, there's really no reason to expect that to change. Even when Fudge has a bad game, you have Blabber, you have Berserker, like, you're going to be able to win matchups like this super consistently, and it's not just the bottom teams that they're able to beat. They clearly showed that they were able to beat some of the more dangerous teams in the league as well. Cloud9 just feels like a tier above everybody else. And then moving on now to our second game of day number 2, and it's another upset. There were quite a fair few of these in week number 1, and this one was a lot of fun to watch. We saw TSM taking on FlyQuest, and TSM takes the series and takes the game, I should say, massive upset here. I don't think a lot of people saw this one coming. One of the bottom teams in the league for a lot of people, with a substitute mid laner, who might just be better than the actual mid laner, going up against a team that most people consider to be a lock to make Worlds in this upcoming split. It is really not panning out right now for FlyQuest. A really rough start to week number 1 for them. Obviously, best of ones are not enough time to really fully evaluate these teams and what their potential upside is going to look like, but Fly not looking great in these best of ones. I've got to be completely honest with you. But TSM actually looking pretty good to start this week. That game against Team Liquid earlier on, some pluses and some minuses. They absolutely got blasted in the early game, which is not great, but they team fought relatively well, and with a couple of different decisions, maybe a little bit more aggressiveness, a little bit more decisiveness coming out from them as a team, they could have been in that game. And so to see them be able to do that and then come down and take down FlyQuest, that's a really, really big win for them. And honestly, gotta shout him out. Player of the game is going to go to Insanity in the mid lane. The man is here. He is only the second ever endemic North American mid laner to ever play for TSM, only behind Reginald. And so quite a ridiculous statement to make there, but he's making the most of it. And he went up against a very good mid laner in Vikla, who, yes, has not played well in his first 2 games of the split. That is absolutely the case. We'll talk about him in a bit, but he looked awesome. That LeBlanc looked unstoppable. This was before the static Shiv LeBlanc changes that ended up becoming really oppressive and really difficult to deal with in side lanes and even in team fights. So this is just full AP assassin, regular LeBlanc, and it was crazy dominant coming out from Insanity. Just really good stuff from him. Far from the only player who played well. Boogie had a really good game on the Jarvan. Honestly, I've liked what I've seen from him in the beginning part of this split. I thought he was a relatively good jungler last split. Certainly not a game breaker, not someone who's going to like carry this team across the finish line, but a decent enough jungler to be able to start at this level. And then Hansar was a lot more decisive in this game. He was pulling the trigger on those ultimates basically whenever it was off cooldown. And because of his follow-up with the LeBlanc, that was the reason they were able to win. A lot of these team fights towards the back half of the game was because those two were connecting, which is what you kind of needed to see from him and Chime in that first game. So it's good to see Hansar make that adjustment on the same champion. Basically, everything you could have asked for from TSM was kind of put forward and more. Wild Turtle did a ridiculous amount of damage on the Lucian, even if his scoreline doesn't necessarily say it. Chime was really good on the Nami. Everybody played well for TSM in this game, but Insanity was really the big hard carry, and really at some point you're going to have a conversation about whether or not you should just keep him in the lineup for the year, especially if he's going to play like this. A great start to the year for him, and hopefully he's going to be able to keep it up. And then for FlyQuest on the other side, something is just wrong with this team. I don't know what it is, but these players are, mechanically speaking, playing significantly below their level, which is incredibly concerning. My dud of the game is going to go to Vikla in the mid lane. I don't really know what's going on. It's not just Vikla, but he was outclassed by Insanity, and it wasn't particularly close. I know I'm high on Vikla. I know I saw him as the best mid laner in the region last split, and I know a lot of people on Reddit especially are going to tell me how insane that I am for saying that, because Vikla was bad. Didn't you watch that 1 or 2 games where he was really bad? And I'm like, yeah. Didn't you watch the 7 or 8 games where he was really awesome? Like, am I going crazy? Or I understand that not everybody watches every single game. That's kind of, the specialty that this channel likes to offer, but I do have to say, like, at least have some level of consistency in terms of what your analysis is. Don't watch one game of FlyQuest and then say that Vikla is trash. He was trash in this one, but I have faith that he's going to be able to bounce back, because it's not just him. Prince is playing absolutely garbage right now for this team. He was awful in the first series. Vulcan is not necessarily doing anything on this team. He's been the best support in North America for 2 years now. Spica looked completely lost in the jungle. It felt like he had no control over anything. Impact is just on tank duty in the top lane, and he really has no pressure. Like, FlyQuest just feels like it's not necessarily working right now. And I don't know what the fix to that is. I don't know what the problem is, and so I don't know what the fix is. They've got to be able to figure it out. Of course, a condensed schedule here in the LCS means that these early losses actually do matter. You don't have nearly as much time to figure out how to fix these problems, and so hopefully they can figure out what's going on, because whatever the impact is right now, whatever the difficulty to overcome is right now, it actually is causing some major problems for this FlyQuest team, and so hopefully they can figure it out, because I think we all want them to be a top team. We want to see the orgs that actually invest in the LCS get rewarded. We don't want to see teams that, bottom feed and don't actually care about being in the league try to, win games. We want to see the teams that actually want to be here and want to invest in the league win. And so, disappointing to see TSM get the win here, but I like these players. It's hard to hate on these players, especially Wild Turtle, Insanity, Chime, Boogie, Hansar. They're super fun to watch. Good North American talent. It's just unfortunate that the org can be a little bit unlikable at times, but really, really good series from them, and honestly not a bad start to the year for TSM. And then moving on to our third game here of day number 2, and it's another pretty intriguing matchup. Two teams that I think have a lot of history between each other, but maybe not with the current iterations. We saw 100 Thieves taking on Team Liquid, and surprisingly, I think Team Liquid is able to take this win. They're looking really good to start this split, and, you know, there still are some question marks about what this team is going to be able to do over the course of an entire split against especially better teams. You know, as good as 100 Thieves is, if that's like your big win, especially with Nuke Duck in the mid lane, there are some questions about that. But overall, I would say Team Liquid honestly looking pretty good at the current moment, which is really nice to see. Again, another org that I think invests a lot into trying to be good and trying to get players and trying to get some synergy going. And so really like what we're seeing out of them. Early player of the game for me is again going to go to Summit in the top lane. Yes, this is what we really want to see. We want to see Summit back. And it really does feel like Summit is back. I'm not going to say that he's entirely back because, again, the problem with him has never been his highest highs. It's been his lowest lows. And that's what you're going to get sometimes out of him is the inconsistency. It's kind of just what he has been over the course of his whole career, even going back to his sandbox days. And so, you know, it's good to see him have these really good games, but you still got to be at least a little bit worried that the negative version of him definitely still could exist. But Summit right now looking incredibly good and a great start to the split from him. He dominated Someday in that matchup on that Jackson. That's not necessarily the easiest matchup in the world to win, and so really, really good for him. Really like what we're seeing out of him. If he can be the #1 top laner in the region, like I said before, Team Liquid's going to be better than people expect them to be. But I have been seeing some comments on social media about this being some sort of 1v9 from Summit, and I don't think I could disagree with that more. As good as Summit has been, it's not any sort of negative towards Summit. I think that completely, like, invalidates the good things that the rest of this team did in this game. Pioshik, yes, he was down a ridiculous amount of CS, but he's playing Sejuani into Kha'Zix. He knew that all he had to do was make sure that Kha'Zix couldn't snowball, and if he hit a point in the game where he got 1 or 2 items, it didn't really matter that he was behind. He was going to be significantly more useful as a champion and as a player. This was actually a really smart game from Pioshik, and I thought he played pretty fantastic. Harry also, very similar boat. He's playing Ahri into LeBlanc. If those go neutral, even if he's down a little bit of CS, Ahri is going to be more useful in the back half of the game, and so another positive. And I honestly think Yon and Core were better than Doublelift and Busio, even if they weren't dominating the early laning phase. They were playing Aphelios Milio into Lucian Nami. Of course, they weren't going to win early, but they were significantly more useful late. And so, I don't understand this like 1v9 kind of mentality for Summit. I don't think that that is the case at all. I think Summit was definitely a great player and the catalyst for a lot of what Team Liquid was doing, but trying to write off what everybody else on this team did as like dragging Summit down, like that's absurd. They all played well in this game, and Team Liquid got the win for a reason. That's just a naive narrative, if I'm being honest. And then for 100 Thieves on the other side, a couple of mistakes. My dud of the game is going to go to Closer in the jungle. Just felt like he got outpathed and outthought this game, and that's going to happen. Unfortunately, you didn't really expect that to happen against a team like Team Liquid, but he really picked that Kha'Zix with the expectation that he was going to be able to snowball the early game, and that was something that 100 Thieves did very well last split. They obviously prioritized the Lucian Nami very heavily as a bot lane, more than any other bot lane. No Zeri pick or ban in this series, certainly something to keep in mind. I don't necessarily hate that idea. Again, I think Zeri's power is a little bit overblown by the fact that I think that there are a lot of other things that enable Zeri that are also really strong right now. Not to say that Zeri's weak, I'm not trying to imply that, but just to say that, you know, I understand why teams might want to prioritize other things first, but unfortunately, it just wasn't going to work out. Closer never got on the board. He was consistently tracked by Vision basically the entire game, and he became completely useless because of it. I saw people call him a mosquito in Twitch chat while the game was going on. I think that's a pretty accurate analogy for the bug in this one. Just not a particularly great game. Nuke Duck was nowhere on the map, played super passive on the LeBlanc. That's always kind of been Nuke Duck's problem, is that he just doesn't take a lot of matters into his own hands. He's just a little bit more reliant on the rest of his team to make the plays and him to kind of bounce off of them, and that was definitely the case. And then Someday, Doublelift, and Busio kind of were the big losers, I would say, in terms of the early game laning phase. Someday not really playing all that bad, but losing to Jax isn't necessarily a great situation as a Cassante. And then Doublelift and Busio were doing okay in the early game, but Yon and Core were significantly more useful because they weren't able to really get any sort of power on that side of 100 Thieves into the bot lane early on in the game. And so positives for 100 Thieves are minimal, I would say. It wasn't a great game from them, but at least it's just one game. It's not a long stretch of time or anything like that. It's just one game against a Team Liquid team that honestly looks pretty good right now, and so I'm willing to cut them a little bit of slack, especially because they don't have their full roster in, but Liquid's looking solid. I really like what we've seen out of them early. This was a much cleaner ending to the game, which I think is very enlightening. That's really what Jan, I think, is going to have to step up and be for this team, is this big late game carry for them. He did a pretty decent job of that in spring. He was super underrated in terms of his performances in the spring split. I think that there were large sections of the split where him and Core were the only good players on Team Liquid, but I think Summit stepping up and Pioshik playing with a little bit of a brain, like that's going to change the outlook of this team completely. Harry being a secondary facilitator in the mid lane, there's just a lot of positives, I think, if this team can like lock in and identify their playstyle and, you know, get better at the things that they were weak on, which honestly they've kind of shown a bit of early on in the split. And then moving on to our fourth game of day number 2 here, and it's a matchup between a 1-0 team and an 0-1 team, but it might have been flipped from what you expected at the beginning of the split. We had NRG taking on Immortals, and Immortals picks up their second victory of the split already in their first 2 games. They're already very, very close to reaching their win total in all of spring, and that really goes to show how important the additions to this team already are showing themselves to be for Immortals. You can talk about Treats, you can talk about Solo and the impact that they've made in shoring up some of the weaknesses that this team had and kind of making sure that the rest of the players on this team have the ability to kind of play up to their optimal standards, and that's exactly what happened. There have been a couple of players on this Immortals team that have played well in the past. Kenvi, Balulu, Tactical all have had moments of looking relatively good at the LCS level, some a little bit more so than others, maybe some in other regions with Balulu or Kenvi, you know, in tier 2 in NA. They've all had moments where they've looked solid and they've looked like they could be really good players at this level, but they really haven't been able to put it together as a team up until this point, but it is working, at least to start this split, and they're beating a good team. You know, we'll talk about NRG in a second. They made a couple of pretty crucial mistakes, especially down the stretch of this game that really felt like it should have been won in favor of them, but Immortals was the one to come out on top, so you gotta give them the credit for that. My player of the game is gonna go to Tactical in the bot lane. Really happy to see Tactical step up and play like this. I'm not gonna lie, this game was the closest I think we've gotten to Team Liquid Tactical in a very long time. He has really not been the player that he was even halfway on Team Liquid, right? He was such a great AD carry, worth it to replace Doublelift on that team, and it wasn't just because they wanted to get younger. Tactical was better for that team than Doublelift was, and so we have to remember the form that he was in, but TSM, not going well, Immortals, not going well, and so it really felt like it was just time to give up on him as a player to be able to play at this high level. It felt like Core maybe was a bigger part of that success than we thought, but maybe he just needed a more comprehensive support system around him. Maybe that was the way to put it. He hasn't exactly played with the best and most proven talent in the bot lane since he left Team Liquid, and that could definitely be something that has impacted him. And coming in and playing with Treats, somebody who he's played with when he was, you know, really on the up and up on TSM Academy back in the past in Treats, I think is something that really is going to help him out a lot and is clearly already working. He was fantastic in the back half of this game. His ability to team fight really is what pushed Immortals over the edge, because the enemy team had a Fed Zeri. It could have been very easy for this Aphelios to just not put out nearly as much damage, for Tactical to step up and be a little bit out of position, just a little bit too far forward like he was last split, but no, he was practically perfect in this game, especially towards the back half, and you got to give him a lot of credit for that. But Treats definitely deserves it as well. A lot of great setup here on the Nautilus. His scoreline doesn't look fantastic. He wasn't actually involved in that many kills, but when he was involved, he was incredibly important, and so I think he was definitely a bigger impact than what his scoreline would suggest. Solo, Kenvi, Balulu all played well. None played, like, expertly. I think Solo actually played really well on the Ornn on the top side. Thought he had a really good week number 1 just in general, but he wasn't like a game breaker by any means. And Kenvi and Balulu were fine, but a couple of mistakes, and would have liked to see them be a little bit more aggressive in the mid game, but still, when you've got a player like Tactical that's going to be able to step up like this in the mid to late game, that's going to be massive. That's really what Immortals was missing last split, and it feels like they might have found it. As for NRG on the other side, man, this is really not how you wanted to start your split. Getting perfect gamed on day number 1 and then losing to what a lot of people see as maybe the weakest roster in the LCS on day number 2. Definitely some problems, at least to start this split. My dud of the game is going to go to Palafox again here in the mid lane. I talked about how in game 1 you really could have given it to anybody on NRG. Well, in game 2 it felt like Palafox was definitely a little bit more of a weak link, which is concerning. I really like Palafox. I think he's been very underrated over the past few splits. Somebody who's actually been a very big positive, a pseudo all-pro player player basically every time he's been given a full opportunity at this level, and unfortunately, it's just not been a great start to the split for him. Again, it's only been 2 games, so I don't want to overreact or anything like that, but his Gragas in this game was pretty miserable, was not able to set up a lot, was going in and really impacting fights in a negative way, especially towards the back half of the game. If he actually hit an ultimate pretty much at any point in this game, it might have been a little bit different, but again, we're all allowed to have bad games every once in a while. It's unfortunate to see a couple back-to-back out of Palafox. FBI and Ignar were super strong in this game, but somehow they weren't able to close it out. I know a lot of people are saying it's impossible for them to have lost with this kind of lead on Zeri Yuumi, and yes, I do think it is difficult, but to say it's impossible, like, again, it's a farce. It's make-believe. Zeri Yuumi is very strong, but it is not unbeatable. It is not this Exodia bot lane, right? You're still going to have to execute on it, and unfortunately, Immortals' execution towards the back half of this game was simply better than NRG's. Even if FBI did a great job gaining that lead in the early game, he could have done a lot more to be able to push that pressure more in the back half. Doklo was just very meh on the Jax. Contracts didn't really do all that much on the Sejuani towards the back half of the game. There really just was no proactivity coming out from NRG, and that's the most concerning part. Hopefully they can figure out, you know, the aggression and where they want to play with this team, because right now it just feels like a bunch of players and not necessarily a team together. And then for Immortals, what a great start to the split for them. 2-0, obviously not the end of the week by any stretch, but this is about as good of a start as you could have asked for a team that I think most people predicted to be near or at the bottom of the standings. And then moving on to our final game of day number 2 here, and it's another really, really, really interesting one, especially in terms of outcome. We had Golden Guardians taking on Evil Geniuses, and EG pick up another really good win here. That drops Golden Guardians to 0-2 to start the split. That brings Evil Geniuses to 2-0 to start the split. Really not how I think we expected a lot of this to go. Kind of exciting in that way. I wish the games maybe were a little bit more exciting, but the results are pretty cool to talk about, so let's go ahead and go over it. Evil Geniuses continue to look really good, enabling a player that I think we all really wanted to see bounce back and get back into the form that we know he can be in, and that is Jojo Pune in the mid lane. He's going to get player of the game again here in their second game as well. Jace is one of those champions where, yes, he's fantastic in the early game, but what we've seen out of some of the best players in the world, typically in the top lane, but the best players in the world can consistently win in the mid game and even in team fights as well on Jace, dealing a crazy amount of damage and setting his team up for a lot of opportunities, and that's what Jojo was in this game. He was the best player in the game pretty consistently on that Jace. He was able to create so much havoc, so much panic for Evil Geniuses that led to the rest of this team really being free to do whatever they want. And, you know, as much as I'm sitting here and hyping up Jojo, and he absolutely deserves it, he is the main carry of this team, I would definitely say, you still have to have other pieces, especially when he's going to be receiving as much attention as he did in this game. You need other players on this team to be able to unlock and play at a very high level, and they're doing that right now. I thought Revenge had a very quietly great game on the Gragas, was just everywhere on the map in the back half of this game, really important in team fights, and honestly was just significantly more impactful than Licorice on the other side of the map on that Rumble, which is really good to see. And then a player that I don't think a lot of people are going to talk about in this game is Ayla in the support position, but that Lulu was near perfect this game. In laning phase, he was able to stop a lot of the aggression that the Lucian Nami was trying to put on. Yes, Stixay and who he certainly could have been more aggressive in the laning phase, which is something I don't often say, but I've now said it twice early on in their split, so that's a little concerning. But Ayla, I think, did a great job in the mid and late game as well to make sure that his entire team was as safe as possible, whether that was protecting Jojo to get his damage off as much as possible, or protecting Unforgiven to make sure that he's in a good spot. Hell, even ulting someone like Armeo to make sure that that Sejuani can be an even beefier front line to have to try and break through on the side of GG, who is quite low damage in this comp. And so overall, I just think that Ayla in particular played this fight really well, or played this game really well. So did Revenge, so did Jojo. Those were the three that really stood out, but Unforgiven and Armeo were more than good as well. Everybody on EG is pulling their weight at the moment. No one is getting carried on this team, which I think is the really important part, even if I do think that Jojo looks like a superstar for this team at the current moment. And then for Golden Guardians on the other side, certainly not how you wanted to start the split. We've talked about the MSI hangover for a couple of teams in the world, and it does feel like Golden Guardians is suffering from that at least a little bit. We expected, you know, a teensy amount of regression coming in from this team. We didn't really expect them to be as dominant as they were in spring. It's just really, it's hard to predict that for a team that already overperformed as much as they did. I think it was realistic to expect them to kind of struggle when they got back to North America, but even I didn't expect them to struggle as much as they have. Yes, two tough opponents, both Cloud9 and Evil Geniuses clearly are good teams here in the league, but Stixay and Huhi have been significantly less aggressive aggressive than they need to be. Stixxay still was able to generate quite a bit of gold in this game just from picking up cleanup kills, but I think that Lucian Nami could have gotten a ton more if they were willing to take more trades. And then I think the top side of this map was just not particularly good. My dud of the game is going to go to Gory in the mid lane, who just kind of was on Cassante. He didn't really do much, was definitely outscaled by JoJo on the Jace, which is a disaster if you're a Cassante. That's certainly not a situation that you want to find yourself in, but River was really doing nothing on that Nautilus jungle pick. That is something that we've seen around the world. Obviously kind of got debuted and popularized at MSI, but you know, we've seen it in other regions as well at this point, and it really never feels like it's good at all. It feels like, yes, like on paper it sets up for things, and you know, in solo queue I can understand how it can be successful, but it really just doesn't give you enough pressure in the early game to be able to justify it at this point, in my opinion. You certainly weren't able to pull it off in this game. And then Licorice, while he did have some good plays, he tried his best in some of these team fights, also took some pretty bad routes in some of these team fights, playing a little bit over aggressive, you know, getting zoned out of that Baron fight was pretty disastrous for Golden Guardians and ended up costing them the game. And so definitely some things that need to be improved on if you're GGs. I want to see more of that aggressive style that we saw out of them in the playoffs and at MSI. If they're not going to give us that, then they're just a collection of players that really aren't that great at team fighting. This team's strength is winning early, and when they're not doing that, they're going to be in a little bit of a pickle. But for EG on the other side, they're actually looking really good right now. I know that JoJo specifically as a player can be relatively, you know, hit or miss, relatively up and down, hot and cold, if you will, and can go week to week, very high variance, but if he's going to play like this, even remotely for the rest of the split, Evil Geniuses could actually maybe even be a contender for a top 2 team. And that means we can now jump into our third and final day here in week 1 of the LCS, and we kicked off day 3 with a battle of undefeated teams so far in week number 1. We had Immortals taking on Team Liquid, and TL coming out on top, and that means a 3-0 week number 1 for Team Liquid. Now, that's exactly what you wanted to see. You really couldn't draw up a better opening week for this team. Basically, every question mark that we had about this roster and about what they were going to do and how they would compare to last split, considering the fact that they really didn't make any changes outside of head coach with Rainover stepping in for Marin. We were really concerned with what was going to happen, and they basically alleviated all of the concerns that we could have potentially had in that slot. That top side of the map has been very legit through the first couple of games, and if that's the case, then they are going to hit their potential. As much as I, you know, love Yon and Core JJ, and I really do think that that bot lane has been underrated over the course of this year, if you can get Summit and Pioshik to be the leaders on this team that they were supposed to be when, you know, this team started up at the beginning of the year, then they are going to hit the potential that we all thought they had, which is a world's caliber team here coming out of the LCS. My player of the game is going to go to Pioshik in the jungle on that Lee Sin. Another pick that he is really good at. I know he doesn't necessarily get a lot of credit for it, because when you think of Pioshik, you obviously think of the Kindred. It's something that comes to mind for basically everybody. That's his champion, but he's been very good at Lee Sin for a very long time. Big shock, Korean jungler, very good at Lee Sin, but, you know, I almost think it's underrated how much of a pocket pick that has been for him over the course of his career because of the Kindred, because it's not as much of a pocket pick as the other champion, but he's been really good at it. He knows how to play the early game and how to really control the jungle matchup, and I think that that's the most important part of playing Lee Sin, is putting yourself in a position where you can control that jungle matchup, and Pioshik did that at a very high level. He was able to generate a lead not only for himself, but also for the bot lane, which I think was really, really big. Yon and Core on that Lucian Nami needed to step up. Again, we've seen this bot lane matchup quite a bit. We've seen teams opt into Lucian and Nami and Aphelios and Milio over the Zera Yumi quite a bit in the LCS, and this is why, because if you do gap your enemy laner, if you are just straight up better, then it's going to be a more valuable pick for you to have in the end. And so really good stuff from Pioshik, really good stuff from Yon and Core JJ, who, like I said, just absolutely gapped tactical and treats. You know, we can talk sometimes about how, you know, jungle matchup can really change the fate of a lane, but when Yon and Core won as hard as they did in the isolated 2v2, you just got to give them a lot of props for that. They did this significantly more often than people gave them credit for last split as well. Yon's numbers were actually unbelievable in the bot lane, a lot better than people give him credit for, and so really, really like this bot lane. I think they're going to continue to grow, and Yon has actually shown, in my opinion, a lot of good things at this level, and of course, Core is Core. Even if he's not necessarily blowing up the stat sheet, we know how valuable he can be to a winning team. And then Summit has also still been terrific. No deaths on Jax in this game. Definitely gapped solo 1v1 in the top lane, was able to deal so much damage in that isolated matchup, really took the Ornn out of the game very quickly, which meant, looking at the, you know, other side of this comp, you've got a Vel'Koz, you've gotten a Aphelios, you don't really have a lot of, you know, peel if your front line is just going to get absolutely destroyed. And unfortunately, unfortunately, that was the case here. You wanted that range, you needed that range in order to try and get some of these less mobile carries into a decent position, but when your frontline melts as fast as, Immortals did because Summit is so strong and he's able to dominate that top lane matchup, it's a little bit of an issue. Harry was good on the Annie, everybody played well on TL. It's very rare to see basically every lane win in one game, but every lane won in this game, and it was very fun to watch for Team Liquid. As for Immortals, their worst game of day number 1, it wasn't a perfect game. They didn't get perfect gamed, but honestly, this might have been the grossest game to watch of game number 1 in terms of the output. Immortals just absolutely got slaughtered. This was not even remotely close. You can give dud of the game to basically anybody. I'm going to give it to Solo in the top lane because, like I said, just getting shredded by Summit was not particularly fun to see, and I think that Ornn pick definitely ended up not working out, but Kenvi got hard gapped in the jungle matchup. Balulu picking his signature Vel'Koz, that and the Zoe are definitely the things that you kind of know Balulu for. Definitely not working out here in a game where you've got a super fed Lee Sin and Lucian and Jax and Annie all just jumping on top of your head. And then Tactical and Treats, like I said, got completely bodied in the bot lane matchup, had no pressure in the early game, and then just had no damage and no survivability in the late game. And so basically all negatives, I would say, for Immortals. Just not a good game at all. 21 minutes honestly undersells how much of a domination this was coming out from the side of Team Liquid. It's okay. We kind of expected Immortals to not be able to hold up. They still had a good week overall. I don't want to take away from the other good things, but I think with as dominant of a week they had up until this point, they probably would have liked to see it end in a different way. But congratulations to Team Liquid. That's a 3-0 week number 1, and this team is legit. They're going to skyrocket in my power rankings. How high? I'm not sure yet, but especially with a lot of the other teams at the top not necessarily performing all that consistently right now, TL is definitely one of the most fearable teams in the league. And then moving on to our second game of day number 3 here, and we kind of assumed this would be a little bit of a top-of-the-table clash, at least at the beginning of the week, but it's a battle between two winless teams up until this point. We had Golden Guardians taking on FlyQuest, and Golden Guardians is going to be the one to snap that losing streak in this one with a win. Really nice stuff coming out from them. Fly actually did play this game relatively tough. They were much more competitive, in my opinion, in this one than they were in a lot of the other games that they lost this week, but still 0-3 as a start to the split for FlyQuest, a team that not only was one of the best teams in the entire league last split, even if they should have done even better, but a lot of people argued that all they did was upgrade this offseason, bringing in what a lot of people saw as the #1 support in North America in Vulcan into the fray. To see Golden Guardians be able to snap that streak from them is really, really good. So good stuff from GG. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, pretty easily going to go to Licorice in the top lane. Really happy to see him not only continue to play with a ton of confidence, but have that translate into a lot of his champion picks. We know he can play some of the more aggressive picks, but hasn't really been a playstyle that Golden Guardians has wanted to go to ridiculously efficiently, I should say. They love putting him on things like the Malphite and the Kennen, things that can be relatively good without a ton of investment, because honestly, River doesn't like to path top lane. It's not really something that he has done a ton over the course of this year, but this was the kind of game where you pick Yone into Gragas and you say, screw it, Licorice, you're going to carry us across the finish line. And with that confidence, with that renewed sense of purpose that he has on this team, he absolutely was going to be able to do that. Very good game from him. Like I said, player of the game, and he absolutely deserved it. It's really great to see that he's not only playing better, but I think a lot of it was mental for him. We knew he could be a very, very good player at this level. We knew he could be someone who could really rise up those top lane rankings, because he has in the past. He's been one of the best top laners for quite a long time in the region, but it felt like he was on that downward trajectory. Turns out all he needed was the confidence to believe in himself again, to know that the team was backed up behind him, that they were willing to put resources and their trust and their games into him. And so really, I think that has completely unlocked Licorice again, and it really does feel like we're getting a lot closer to Cloud9 Licorice than anything that we saw post Cloud9, which is just the best thing you could possibly say. And then the rest of the team kind of stepped up as well. I thought River was pretty terrific in this game on the Sejuani. A lot of setup coming in from him. You need that Yone to really pop off, but without, the setup from the Sejuani, it would have been a lot more difficult for that Yone to have a good game. And so really good to see River continuing to play at a high level. And then Gory, Stixay, Huki were much better, I would say, in this game. Gory still had a couple of mistakes, a couple of times where he was a little bit too far forward, forward, getting caught out at the beginning of team fights, but for the most part, the Azir damage was definitely still there, and it was a great compliment to the rest of this team. Stixxay played a little bit better on the Aphelios. Still want to see him be a little bit more aggressive, but, you know, when you've got a Yone on the top side, again, I understand why you feel the need to maybe be a little bit more of the safety net rather than the big aggressive piece, and Huhi on the Lulu, I think was fine as well. Was definitely a big piece in a lot of the late game team fights, even if the early laning phase wasn't the most dominant coming out from Golden Guardians again. And so I would say good stuff, not great stuff. Definitely would like to see a more convincing performance from Golden Guardians, but they are able to pick up their first win of the split, and I think that definitely counts for something. And then for FlyQuest on the other side, I don't know what to tell you. This is disastrous for them. Starting 0-3 is literally the worst case scenario for everything you could have asked for. They might be the only winless team to come out of week number 1, and that would just be horrendous. There really is no turning around from that. There were good moments in this game, and I think some of these players played better in this game than they did in some of the others earlier in the week, but it doesn't matter. If you're not able to pick up the win, if you're not able to win the late game team fights, then what's even the point of playing well? My dud of the game is going to go to Impact on the top side. Like I said, Licorice was awesome in this game. He did receive some assistance, but a lot of it was him just outplaying his lane opponent, and his lane opponent was Impact, who has, kind of gotten back to Impact form. Really, I think the big thing I was worried about for Impact on this team going into the split was his laning. That was something that was really a massive problem for him in 2022 on Evil Geniuses, was not really living up to expectation in terms of surviving in the early laning phase. Still was always a very good team fighter, but was giving a lot of advantages and leads over to his enemy top laner that they could then use to cause problems in the mid to late game, and that's kind of what we've seen through the first week here. It's not been nearly as egregious as I think it had been at some points in the past, but it's certainly something to look out for, as it has been a trend for Impact in the past. But, he wasn't the only player to play bad. I think that, again, there were a couple of team fights where Vikla just wasn't really on the money with the Annie. It wasn't really his game to win or lose for the team, and so I'm not going to blame him entirely, but I still want to see more of a breakout, fantastic carry performance from him. Prince and Vulcan were pretty good in lane on the Xayah Rakan. They needed to be in this matchup, but again, you need to have a lot of stable damage coming out from those two in team fights to be able to win, and it just doesn't feel like Prince has that X factor right now, and I don't really know what it's going to take for him to get that. I don't know if it's a synergy thing with the rest of this team. I don't know if it's just confidence or if it's the form that he's in. I don't know what the problem is with Prince. We know he can get there. We know he can be legitimately one of the best AD carries in the entire world, but he just has not been a takeover threat, even if every game hasn't exactly been his problem, although the first two games were not very good from him, and Vulcan's just been fine. He certainly has not been a game changer for this team, which you were really expecting with him coming in. I think the one player that you can look at in this game as playing well is going to be Spica in the jungle, who I do think had a lot of good moments on the Viego, a lot of them getting a little bit of, some cleanup kills, resets on the Viego, but at the same time, at least somebody was getting something on this side. It felt like there was no consistent damage coming out from FlyQuest, and so Spica being able to pick up something in these team fights was certainly understandable, but this Fly team just simply needs to be better, and they need to be more cohesive. A lot of the problems that it seemed that they have towards the back half of the split seem even worse now, which is just about the scariest thing I could possibly say to a FlyQuest fan. I, again, have faith that they're at least going to be able to figure out and be competent, but the upside of this team is going to start to worry me if they continue to struggle like this. Remember, the split is shorter. It's, week 1, every single week is a super week now, and so you don't have nearly as much time to have games like this. You need to be able to figure it out, and figure it out fast. But for Golden Guardians, at least they were able to pick up their first win of the split. Doesn't completely dissuade a lot of the worries that I had for this team. I'm still going to need to see, especially this bot lane, to get close to the form that they were at in spring, because it really feels like they've taken a little bit of a mental break in week number 1. Gory has not been nearly as good, and if this top side is going to stay solid, that's going to be big for them, but this entire team needs to continue to try and step up, and one win over a dismantling FlyQuest team right now is certainly not going to dissuade all of my fears. And then moving on to our third game of day number 3 here, and it was a matchup between a team that was undefeated moving into the day and a winless team moving into the day, so of course, it did not go as you would expect. We had Evil Geniuses taking on Dignitas, and Dignitas was able to pick up the win in 35 minutes. Of course Dig won. Is anybody even really surprised? This is how the LCS has worked all week long up until this point, with all the upsets, all the crazy results that we had seen. Nobody was predicting EG to be able to walk out of week 1 3-0, and nobody was predicting Dig to walk out of this week 0-3, purely because that was just not going to happen. That's not how this league works, and so Dig winning, not particularly surprising if you just look at it from that perspective. From a gameplay perspective, yeah, I'm pretty surprised. This EG team definitely felt like it was finding a groove, and it felt like very much a good week. We had talked about Jojo Pune in particular in the past as somebody who had been very week-to-week dependent, not really game-to-game dependent. He would have very good weeks and then very bad weeks, and it felt like this was just going to be a good week for Evil Geniuses and for JoJo Pune, but alas, here we are, Dignitas taking the game, and you do got to give a couple of these players credit, in particular, the top lane here. Player of the game is going to go to Rich, and I was right to be excited about his fit alongside the rest of this league. I wasn't a gigantic fan of Rich at really any point in his time in either the LCK or the LPL. I thought he was a good player for Victory 5 last year. I've seen some people say that he was hard stuck on V5 last year. Those people are delusional. Rookie and PP God were easily the two best players on that team, and even if you don't agree with that, I mean, Reddit can't make up its mind about whether or not it likes Photic, I guess, because Rich, while he was good, he was a good weak side top laner for that team. He certainly wasn't carrying them across the finish line, and don't forget, he was the sole reason that Nongshim Red Force team did not make Worlds in 2021 as well, and so, you know, he definitely didn't, his playstyle I just don't think meshes well with leagues like the LCK and the LPL, but in a region where he can be a little bit more passive in the early game, I think his ability to team fight in these big Fiesta fights a lot better really comes out for Dignitas, and so far, it's been really good, and honestly, he's been much better in lane than I was giving him credit for to start the year. He was definitely the best player in this game for Dignitas, and really he's definitely been the best player across their first couple of games. On the Cassante, he has the opportunity and the ability to kind of take over the team fights, take over the pace of the game. That champion is really strong right now, especially when you pair him with something like a Cassiopeia in the mid lane. I actually think that duo is very difficult to deal with, especially in the late game, and you add on to that the fact that Tomo and Diamond, I think, did a lot better in lane in particular in this game, and Dignitas actually has a setup to be able to win. Santorin wasn't blown out in the first 10 minutes of the game like he had been in basically every other opportunity. I'm not sure if Armeo just wanted to play a little bit more of a passive style, but he wasn't nearly as active as a lot of other junglers have been against this Dignitas team early on. That was kind of the big problem, is that Dig would give over so many resources so early on in the game, whether that be through bot lane or through mid lane or through the jungle somewhere on the map. The other team was basically just getting resources for free because every other team had a numbers advantage basically everywhere they went. That wasn't the case in this game. I'm not sure if that was Santorin doing a better job of tracking, or if the Evil Geniuses team wasn't just as aggressive as the other teams that Dignitas had faced up until this point, but they got time to be able to scale into a late game where that Cassante Cassio could actually start to take over, and it absolutely worked. So credit to Rich, I thought he played really well. I know a lot of people are criticizing Diamond, and I will agree, it certainly wasn't a perfect game from him coming out in the support position. A couple of rogue engages that certainly weren't very good from the Rakan, but, you know, I want to give him some time. Like, this is somebody who was really good in the NACL last split, arguably the more important version of the duo of Tomo and Diamond. I would say Diamond was a bigger catalyst for why that bot lane was so much of a success, and people were so willing to jump on the Tomo train. I'm very much willing to give Diamond a little bit more time to gel with the rest of this team. I know he didn't have a perfect game in this one, but certainly willing to see more of him than what we saw in this game. And then Santorin and Jensen were much better. Easily their best performance as a duo, like I said, this split so far. Certainly a lot of upgrades still to come, but Dignitas looks alright for now. And then for Evil Geniuses on the other side, you've just got to be disappointed. Really, there's no other word to say it. I don't want to freak out too much because, again, they actually looked really good before this game this week, and it is a best of one. If, you know, every league was a best of one, JDG would certainly not be undefeated right now. We would see teams like AL and LGD actually doing well in the LPL because best of ones are just not a good indicator for how good a team actually is. And so I don't want to penalize Evil Geniuses too much for losing this game, but you kind of wish they didn't lose this game. You would have felt so good about this team if they walked out of week number 1 going 3-0, going undefeated, especially with their new players, but couldn't quite get the job done. My dud of the game is going to go to Unforgiven in the bot lane. It just felt like he wasn't positioning all that well. There were so many opportunities for the engagers on the side of Dignitas to get on the backline because I think Unforgiven was just a little bit too aggressive in terms of what he was trying to do without really a lot of backup. You had JoJo on more of a, I don't want to say a facilitator because Ari's not a facilitator, but more of a playmaker rather than a damage carry, which is not really what this Evil Geniuses team has done over the first couple of games. And so I think a lot more responsibility was placed on Unforgiven in the bot lane, and it didn't necessarily go great in this game. I actually think Ayla played relatively fine. You could definitely argue he was the better support in this game, but Unforgiven, unfortunately, just a little bit too aggressive. I think they're going to be able to rein it in. It still is very early, and I would much rather him have the problem of being too willing to try to make plays when he is the carry for the team, rather than being too passive and kind of just sitting back and doing nothing. That's what Spawn did last year for this Dignitas team, and people were really mad about him. So Revenge and Armeo were were fine. Revenge was definitely the worst top laner in this matchup, but he was Scion into Cassante. Not a ton you can do there. And Armeo, like I said, I just don't think punished Santorin hard enough. Not that Santorin made any major mistakes, but he's shown that he's going to be slow to react to a lot of aggressive plays coming in. And I just don't think Evil Genius has made enough of those aggressive plays in the early game. And so, yes, you know, they did lose here, and they probably shouldn't have lost here, but like I said, it is a best of one, so it's not the best indicator whether or not Evil Geniuses could beat this Dignitas team. I still believe in them quite a bit, even if they weren't able to get the job done here. And for Dig, you still got a lot to prove in terms of consistency, but I'm glad to see Rich performing well. That's definitely going to increase the floor of this team. Hopefully, the rest of the team can follow suit. And then moving on to game number 4 here of day number 3, and it's another pretty intriguing matchup that definitely gives us a little bit more information about some of these teams. We saw NRG taking on 100 Thieves, and NRG picks up their first win of the split. That means there is only going to be one winless team to move out of week number 1, that being FlyQuest, which I'm sure no one predicted coming into the split. That couldn't possibly be on anyone's radar, but nonetheless, this was a good win for NRG and one that I think they definitely needed in order to feel a lot more comfortable. They honestly made really easy work of 100 Thieves, and it definitely goes to show that maybe that 100 Thieves win on day 1 wasn't nearly as convincing as we might have thought it was. Beating FlyQuest at the time looked pretty good, but they looked pretty bad in both of their follow-up games, and so we'll talk about them in a bit. First of all, I've got to point out, you've got a coach in the lineup and an extra coach on stage 4 draft, and you still miss a ban? What is going on? Come on, 100 Thieves. But for NRG on the other side, what a game coming in from Contracts. Really like to see him play aggressive again. It felt like this team was really lacking identity through the first couple of games. It felt like they didn't exactly know what they wanted to do, especially in the early game. I wasn't going to blame anyone in particular for that, because you never really know, especially with new players being added, what the deal is going to be in terms of early game pathing, in terms of their preparation for enemy teams. But this game felt a lot cleaner, and I mean a lot cleaner in terms of what they were able to do. Contracts is going to get my player of the game for NRG. He honestly jungled circles around Closer in this one. Closer playing Lee Sin as well in a situation with the Renekton on the top side where he should have at least some pressure with an Annie who's more than willing to try to get out on the map, and he just really lost it all almost instantly. Didn't play nearly aggressively enough, was willing to give over almost everything to a Kha'Zix, and that's never a situation that you want to be in. Kha'Zix getting ahead is not really where you want to be when you're looking at Zeri and when you're looking at Annie. You're like, I don't want to face a fed Kha'Zix, and unfortunately they kind of had to deal with that this game because Contracts just kind of ran that jungle matchup. And so big respect to him. If he can continue to play an aggressive style, be a little bit more of a carry for this team, I do think that's going to be a pretty big bonus, especially if Palafox is going to, I don't want to say take a little bit of a step back, but if he's going to be a little bit more rough around the edges than he has been the past couple splits, this team is going to need Contracts quite a bit. And so to see him step up in this game, I think is very good. But the players that I think are going to get underrated the most are the bot lane. I know people don't like to talk about FBI and Ignar all that much, especially in recent memories in positive lights. You know, when I was ranking him highly on Evil Geniuses, people were pretty upset by that. I'm a little bit lower on Ignar myself, and so I understand the kind of negative attitudes that I think a lot of people have towards this decision to bring them in, but I like FBI a lot as a player, and this is the kind of game that shows why, because you give him Aphelios into Zeri, one of the most common, if not the most common bot lane matchup in the world right now, and he just absolutely slaughtered Doublelift in this matchup. You can give a lot of credit to Ignar, who did play well, but FBI outplayed Doublelift at basically every turn in this game, and that's really what you're looking for when you are NRG. You're looking for a bot lane that's going to be able to step up and be a power point on the map in the early game. That's what FBI was really known for when he burst onto the scene with Golden Guardians back in the day. Obviously has transitioned into a very good team fighter as well, but you know, he can still kind of dominate laning phases, and I'm really impressed with what he was able to do in this game. But again, give credit to Ignar as well. I think jungle and bot lane were definitely standout. Dokla was really good in the top lane, some pressure there, even though I think Someday definitely had some early leads, just couldn't convert it into anything because the rest of the map was losing. And then Palafox was fine, didn't necessarily need to dominate that mid lane matchup in order to be more useful on the Syndra in the late game when the rest of the map was going well, and so just good stuff all around from NRG. And then for 100 Thieves on the other side, dud of the game is pretty easily going to go to Closer in the jungle. I think I kind of contemplated giving this to Nuke Duck in the mid lane, but he was fine, and especially considering the fact that he's not the full-time starter that he is filling in here. I wanted to give him at least a little bit more leniency than I would give some of the other players, and Closer is just not playing well. This very much feels like exactly what I was saying for most of the spring split about Closer in the jungle as well. I was kind of hoping for a bounce back coming in from him with a little bit more stability in this team, but it really does feel like maybe the lack of distinct shot calling on this team coming from basically any of the roles, you used to have that potentially in a player like Huhi, but the lack of distinct shot calling coming in on this team is definitely hurting Closer. I'm not sure if it's vision control, I'm not sure if it's just aggression, but he seems very scared to go and make plays, even on champion like Lee Sin, that he has historically been fantastic on. I see people saying he shouldn't be playing Lee, he should be on Sejuani and Maokai duty all the time, and I'm like, man, have you watched Closer? He's so much worse on those engaged tanks than he is on Lee Sin and than he is on Jarvan and a lot of these more aggressive picks that can go in and try to deal damage. When he's struggling on those, that is a major problem for this team. Closer is in very bad form, and honestly, he's kind of been in bad form all of 2023. A couple of games have dissuaded that thought at least a little bit for me, but it's not like the rest of this team is picking up the slack. Nukeduck was very bad in the mid lane. He was relatively even for most of the early game, but fell apart just completely in team fights, and then Someday, very similar, was actually ahead in the early game because Renekton into Cassante. That's just what happens, but was like a complete non-factor in the late game. Doublelift and Bucio got blasted in the laning phase. 100 Thieves just kind of lost this game basically from moment one. I know I've said that a lot over the course of this week so far, but that really is the case. A lot of these games have been very early leads coming in from one of the teams and then the other team just not being able to recover and the game being over. That was the case for 100 Thieves in this one, but a good win for NRG. They don't end week one without a win, and that's pretty much the best thing you can say about it overall for them. And that's going to bring us to our final game of the week here in week number 1 of the LCS, and it is a pretty damn good one, as we saw a matchup between Cloud9 and TSM, a historic rivalry, maybe the most historic rivalry here in the LCS, especially now that CLG is gone, and C9 does get the win. This team is just relatively unstoppable at this point. This was a pretty fun game to watch, but C9 are just absolute maniacs. They skill check everyone that they go up against, and they pass that skill check every single time because they really just are better than everybody else at the LCS level, and it's not particularly close. Again, a very fun series, I would say, overall from both of these teams, but really from C9. A lot of these players incredibly talented. Player of the game for me is going to go to Eminus in the mid lane. That's 3 games this week, 3 different player of the games for Cloud9. Berserker in game 1, Blabber in game 2, Eminus in game 3, and it's not like Fudge and Sven were bad. Well, Fudge was alright in game number 2, but this team was definitely, I would say, a unit more so this week than they were one individual player just kind of carrying them across the finish line, and that's pretty much everything that you could possibly want to see out of Cloud9, and then some. Eminus on this Cassante, it's been a big pick for this team, a surprisingly good pick for Cloud9 over the course of this year so far, and honestly, I think North American mid laners have adapted to that Cassante better than I expected. They've actually played that pick at a very high level, more consistently, I would say, than a lot of other regions that are around their skill level, and so that's pretty cool to see, and Eminus is certainly no exception to that. He was a lot of fun on the Cassante in this game. Not only was he really good in that laning phase against Insanity, who we'll get to, actually had a pretty decent game, but he was so useful in a lot of those late game team fights, was just able to deal so much damage after using that ultimate. Some people say that picking a tank in the mid lane is going to be a little bit of a problem if you don't have somebody who can carry in terms of damage, but first of all, they have a Kindred in the jungle, they're going to be fine, and second of all, Cassante just presses R, and now all of a sudden, he's Yasuo, and so no, I'm not worried about the damage. I think that champion is ridiculously overbalanced right now, and clearly Eminus knows how to take advantage of it. But the rest of the team was great too. Blabber was a blast to watch on Kindred, as he basically always is. This was sneakily one of the picks that he used to be known for. I know a lot of people don't necessarily remember the Kindred era for Blabber, but cast your minds, if you will, back to, I believe it was 2019, maybe it was 2020, somewhere in that area where Blabber was making his debut. You know, it was either his first or second split in the league, and the dude was basically a Kindred one-trick, especially in terms of being able to win games. Kindred and Gragas were the 2 picks that I think a lot of people associated with him for a super long time. So him pulling it out here, you know, that's really good to see. He was great on it. Fudge was good on the Gragas in the top lane. Berserker and Sven are just so consistent in terms of what they're going to offer, basically, in every single game. And so, yeah, congratulations to Cloud9. This team looks absolutely unstoppable at the moment. And then for TSM on the other side, there's some good and there is some bad. The good is Insanity in the mid lane, who just continues to be this team's best player. And I would expect that to continue continue over the course of this split. Honestly, when you look at their players on their team, Insanity's probably the most mechanically talented player that they have. I like Hanser. I think he's underrated as a top laner, but he certainly hasn't kicked off the split very hot. Boogie's fine. Certainly not a mechanical god, but not a scrub either. Just kind of a good player at this level. And then Wild Turtle and Chime can have good moments, but are relatively inconsistent. I think Insanity is like the upside piece for TSM here, and so certainly don't want to see a world in which he ends up getting replaced in a couple of weeks for a player in Ruby that has shown almost nothing at the LEC level to deserve an opportunity here on TSM. But, you know, congratulations to Insanity, even though he was going into Eminus, and even though Eminus did have a good game, was pretty active in the early game, Insanity was the one keeping TSM in it, and so definitely worth calling that out. But nobody else on this team really played all that well. Boogie had some good engages. I don't want it to seem like he played awful. He just is who he is, and that's not a negative towards him. He's just an okay player, and that's just what Boogie is. No insult to him again. Starting caliber jungler, but isn't going to change the fate of the game. You're really relying a lot on this bot lane, especially in games where you're playing against good teams where Insanity can't just generate these massive leads in the mid lane, and unfortunately, you picked Jhin Karma, and so you didn't really have any pressure at all. Wild Turtle is going to get my dud of the game. He was dealing negative damage this game, which is just kind of what Jhin does. Like, I hate to be the guy to say that, but that really is just Jhin. Not a super strong pick in the meta right now, but this is kind of Wild Turtle. This is what he did even last split. We saw a lot of Ezreal. We saw a lot of Jhin. It wasn't a lot of Zeri. It wasn't a lot of Lucian. It wasn't a lot of Aphelios. Those aren't the picks that he feels the most comfortable on. It's these classic picks that he's had a lot of years of experience on that he feels more comfortable going to, which obviously, if it's working, I'm willing to allow it to kind of be through. But if you're going to pick Jhin and still deal no damage and not win on it, like, that's going to be a little bit of a problem. And so, you know, as much as I like the Ezreal and as much as I like the Jhin as picks, I just don't think that is a strategy that you can continue to go to as TSM, especially against the best teams in the league that just aren't going to give up the same kind of advantages that you would need for those picks to work out. And so, you know, TSM definitely still has some flaws, but they had a really rough schedule, I would say, in week number 1, running into Team Liquid, running into Cloud9, couple of rough games. They were still able to take down FlyQuest, and so obviously there's something in here for TSM, especially if they keep Insanity in, but I'm certainly not sold on them being a playoff team by any means. And then for Cloud9 on the other side, speaking of playoff teams, this team is number 1 until they prove otherwise. There really doesn't seem to be a team in the league that I feel all that confident is going to be able to match them. The middle feels more clumped than ever in the LCS, and that just makes even more room at the top for Cloud9. All right, but that is going to do it for the LCS Week 1 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Up on the screen, you're going to see the updated LCS standings. Of course, any ties will just be broken in alphabetical order. We've got a lot of ties, especially for that 5th place spot. A lot of teams going 1 and 2 this week, and so you certainly know there's a lot of turmoil, and that brings us to the first column on the right, which is going to be my updated power rankings after week number 1. Of course, in the second column to the right, you can see how that has changed from the preseason power rankings. We can go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers, but I just have to say this out the gate. If you are here for the power rankings, if that's why you clicked on the video, if that's why you watch a lot of the content that I put out, you want to see at the end of the week where I rank everybody, what my thoughts are, what I have to say on everybody, I'm sorry, but this week is just not for you, because I have no freaking clue what these power rankings are supposed to look like. I have no idea who's good. I have no idea who's not good. Nobody showed anything even remotely consistent in week number 1, with the exception of 2 teams. And so, yeah, there are a couple of positives that I want to point out, a couple of negatives that I want to point out, but this could all change in a couple of weeks, and I'm still scared to make drastic changes, and so that's why these power rankings might look a little bit weird, especially in terms of some of the rankings. But with that disclaimer out of the way, risers, fallers, Cloud9 stays atop at number 1, but Team Liquid is going to jump all the way from number 7 to number 2. Outside of C9, they were clearly the best team in week number 1. Now, this might be an overreaction, but this is a team with incredibly talented players that has been known to be good in the past. Summit and Pioshik in particular, obviously, have the talent to be able to dominate this league, and it finally feels like maybe they have a coach in Reignover that knows what they're doing here. Marin, obviously, no coaching background, no coaching experience before last split, and this team feels so much more disciplined. They feel so much more controlled in the early game. Again, it's only 3 games, but they were 3 really good games. So for now, very tentatively, and almost only because no other team showed any consistency, they're going to jump to number 2. Golden Guardians is going to stay at 3. I didn't think they had a particularly good week, but I don't don't know, man. Like, they have upside, and that's more than I can say about other teams around them. Fly is only going to fall to 4. If they continue to struggle, they're going to drop out of the playoffs very fast. But again, there just aren't enough teams that are in this area that I feel more confident in moving forward. And so Fly for now is going to stick at 4 because the talent should be better than this, and they had a really bad week. Hopefully they can bounce back from it. Evil Genius is going to move up to 5. They were probably the 3rd best performing team this week. I wish they didn't drop that random game to Dignitas. I probably would have put them at number 3 if they didn't do that, but gotta respect the fact that they were relatively inconsistent. 100 Thieves is going to fall to 6 again, a team that I would have put lower if for the fact that they're getting a new mid laner next week, and I have faith that hopefully they should be a little bit more cohesive when they get their actual roster in. So that's the only reason those top 6 stay in the top 6. Energy falls down to number 7. They really weren't all that bad, especially to close out the week, but they were certainly not consistent to start it. They got absolutely blasted in both of their first 2 games. Immortals moving up to 8. They're clearly the best of the bottom teams, and honestly, they have significant upward mobility and upward trajectory in terms of what they could do if they continue to be this good. This team could very easily jump into the top 6, hell, even the top 4 with a 3-0 or a 2-1 week next week, and so really excited to see what Immortals does. And then bottom 2 teams are TSM and Dignitas. I don't really think a lot of people are going to disagree with that. Maybe some people see higher expectation in TSM, but I think we're seeing the best version of them, and that version is just kind of it's just kind of all right, right? So yes, their schedule's been hard, but I don't really trust them, and Dignitas is the worst team in the league. I don't think I'm going to get really any sort of pushback on that. And so those are my updated power rankings. Long explanation aside, it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 1 in the LCS. My player of the week, to nobody's surprise, is going to go to Summit. The top laner for Team Liquid just played really well across the entirety of this first week, is a big reason why I feel good about Team Liquid. If you're getting a more consistent version of him this split, this team is going to be good. They're going to be a top 2, top 3 team in the league, and week 1 gave me just about as much confidence as I could possibly have in a situation like that. Gotta give a big shout out to Jojo Pune on Evil Genius, is another big candidate for that player of the week, but Team Liquid had a little bit of a better week overall, so I ended up giving it to Summit. But then we get into my dud of the week in week number 1, and honestly, a lot of people are going to want this to be a FlyQuest player, but for me, I think individually speaking, the worst player in week number 1 was Closer, the jungler for 100 Thieves. I just was so unimpressed with what I saw from him in every game that they played. Even their win on day 1 over FlyQuest, where he was fine. It was probably Spica's worst game of the week, but, you know, he was so miserable in the last 2 days that I simply have to give him my Dud of the Week award. Again, you gotta give Vikla and Prince and Impact some sort of consideration here, as well as maybe even a player like Palafox on NRG, who was really bad in week number 1. But for me, Dud of the Week in week 1 is gonna go to Closer, and Player of the Week in week 1 is going to go to Summit. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Who am I too high on? Who am I too low on? Again, take these power rankings, especially this week, with a huge, huge tub of salt, because I have no idea where these teams are. Hopefully it clears up in the upcoming weeks. But if you did enjoy the video, I really would appreciate it if you left a like. Really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. We're going to be posting a lot of LCS content every single week on every single game, but we don't only post about the LCS on this channel. We post about all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL every single week. So if you want weekly recaps of all of those leagues, this is the place for that. Hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.